Hello, Andrew. I am here today having this conversation with my good friend Andrew Crosby, Alvaro Cedeno on this end. In case you don't know who I am a little bit out of my comfort zone today because even though I've been recording 10 dialogues like this one before, this is the first one in English. So let's see how ideas flow. Good morning for me and good afternoon for you in Geneva.
Hi, Alvaro. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sure it's going to flow fine. Yeah, I think it'll be great. I've enjoyed your other interviews, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion with you.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump straight in. And interestingly, today we are here to discuss an article that you published in December that somehow I would say is nurtured from months of discussions that we held last year as fellows at the Geneva Center for Security Policy around, well, multiple topics, especially the one that you so well crafted in your article called A Brief Agenda for the Next Renaissance. And your argumentation was flowing in the direction of wondering if the Renaissance was what it was, aren't we approaching a moment like that one where we break away from an old paradigm and start transitioning into a new one? And what times are these to have this discussion? You were prescient with your article. Tell us a little bit about it, please.
Yeah. The idea of the article grew out of the feeling that we weren't really coping properly. We as a system, as societies, as governments, weren't really coping with the kinds of changes that we were seeing. And those were two kinds of changes, really. One that I think most people know about, which is this transformation that's taking place because of climate change and everything that comes from that. And you can start with the IPBES report estimating the loss of up to 1 million species in the next decades. So this is dramatic. It means that our targets, even as good as they are, haven't been really working, right? Or the targets may have been in the right direction, but we haven't been fulfilling them. And that demands a change. In fact, unusually for a UN report, it says there must be fundamental transformation of our systems. And on the other hand, there's this other trend which I don't think is really considered as as transformative, which is that of technology and what's happening and how technology is changing the way we produce and consume. Those are things we all know, but one of the aspects of that technological change is that what we're doing is essentially, as they say, dematerializing. So we're using less and less materials in a way, or more and more knowledge, more and more human input. So the added value of everything that we do is increasingly reliant on knowledge. And as I thought about those two things go together. They go together really intimately because we're not going to solve the climate related issues just by doing more of what we did. And I don't believe we're going to do it by just cutting ourselves off and regressing. That's an interesting part of the discussion we could have. But here in our other hand is this opportunity to harness technology to be less material intensive and to be more inclusive if we decide to do it that way. So the idea of the Renaissance for me was we have in our hands both this challenge and the potential response. We have to decide ourselves who we are. In a way, we have to redefine ourselves into the new systems and into the way we're going to work into a more regenerative world, one that is actually gaining in ecological health, gaining in sociological health.
I think that it's critical that we are having this discussion at this time, thinking in terms of climate change, which is a topic that we haven't heard much of the last couple of weeks. The Northern Hemisphere just completed the warmest winter in recorded history. So climate change isn't stopping. The planet isn't really taking a break through this sanitary crisis. Yeah, you might see a few animals that were already there roaming the streets here and there, and that's nice to see. It's nice to see resilience happening before our eyes. But let me pause and highlight the question you just made about the Renaissance. You say that during the Renaissance, the people of the time asked themselves, who are we? And if everything started with that question, then how should we focus that question today? Should we ask ourselves the same thing? And from where should we expect the answers? Because back then, hundreds of years ago, the answers and the thought leadership and the innovation came from art and science. So where would you expect today that we see some of those answers coming from?
Yeah, yeah, right. So I think who are we is a really fundamental question. I mean, so it's an age-old question, not only one of the Renaissance, but I think we have an opportunity to ask it again in a way that's essential for us to do if we're going to transition not only through the climate crisis, but through the technological social evolution that we're going through. That will be a crisis also. So we need to start re-envisioning how we fit, who we are, what do we care about, what do we value? Because the governance that we have doesn't give us values. We give governance values, and so now is the time when we can provide those values. But I think it's probably, I wouldn't expect that our existing governments, for the most part, not national governments, and certainly not international governance is going to take the lead there. Not in many cases. There's probably some. So some of that change, some of that leadership, I think is already bubbling up all over the place. And you and I are in touch with, and probably everyone knows, people who are innovating around all sorts of things. They're innovating around how do you restore ecosystems through whatever, mangrove restoration, or how do we make regenerative agriculture pay for itself, right? How does it work, and what are the long-term effects, and how do you value it correctly? But it's also social arrangements. So how do communities sustain themselves, and how do we re-engage people? There are innovators working in all of those areas. They're bubbling up all over the place, and I think part of what we need is a framework, an enabling framework to make that happen, to help it happen. So we have all this innovation, but it's still very small scale compared to the bulk of our economic and social activity. So those efforts need help. Where are they going to get help? So I think a lot of the usual suspects, for example, governments, are maybe not the right place to go. As I said, although municipalities, city governments actually have a tremendous amount of flexibility, and we see a lot of innovation in municipal governance. That's something that could get pushed forward and supported. In fact, I mean, we know already that cities are becoming more and more active on the kinds of issues that are needed to sustain themselves. And so I think this is a big area of potential growth to find and support these kinds of solutions. Another place is through philanthropy. So philanthropists have I think a tremendous and difficult choice ahead of them. Do you focus on climate change, or do you focus on these intersecting issues between climate and social transformation that will be required? I would argue the climate change piece has been well recognized by people, by top philanthropists like Larry Kramer, but the technological and the social change piece, I don't think has been adequately recognized, and I think that's the one that can help us make that shift. So, yeah, I think that's kind of a short answer. I think it's going to have to bubble up, and how it then becomes, how it propagates. This is, really needs a supportive system. So we need thinkers there too. We need philosophers again. actually. Uh, but you know, there's some really brilliant people out there. We're not short of brilliant people. You have people on the ethical side. You have people like Kate Raworth, who's talking about circular economy. You have Weil and Posner, who've done this brilliant book called Radical Markets. You may not. Some people don't like markets. They think that markets are our problem. I don't think markets are our problem. I think the values we put into markets could be our problem. And Weil and Posner suggest some other ways that we could use markets that are much more distributive and equitable. Let's get creative. This is the time to do it. But those efforts need enabling environments. So we all need to push that way, but particularly those with resources.
I think a thought that comes to mind when I hear you speaking about this is the fact that innovation requires constraints. We don't invent something new in a vacuum. We are constrained by nature. We are constrained by infrastructure. We are constrained by finance. We are constrained by the laws of gravity. We are constrained by the way life works and how it operates. And I think that some of the thought process that should influence our innovation is making sure that what we create, the new solution, the new big thing that we come up with, isn't causing a bigger problem somewhere else. And this is a very interesting challenge for innovators that like innovating, because it means that we need to pay attention to a whole different level of limits that are out there that are not limiting our creativity. They're just telling us which way to go. You have like a framework within which you are able to innovate, and that's where we need to operate. Having said that, I think the younger generations, the school kids that have been demonstrating for the climate emergency for almost a year and a half, are very much aware of the fact that our behaviors today have a holistic, long-term impact on the planet beyond our national borders. So they have this global awareness that I claim that no other generation of human beings had ever had. You and I learned about globalization going to school and living abroad and already, as adults and professionals. But these younger kids, they are born globally aware. So this is an opportunity that I think could help us in terms of bringing them into the conversation of innovation, the same way you suggest to bring philosophers, that we need philosophers. And I think that is absolutely pertinent. So you also say in your article that we need to build a new narrative. And I created an acronym from your article, and it reads a new narrative for peace, but peace spelled Peece. And it stands for a new narrative in politics, in ethics, in environment, in culture, and in economy. And I think that the interesting thing about this, thinking in terms of Yuval Harari, and he argues that building narratives is our one key distinctive characteristic as a species, because we're able to create a fiction and have others pursue that fiction together and collectively move forward in a particular direction. So you say that we need a new narrative for peace. How do you think that this narrative should start? Where should we begin? Who should get the ball rolling?
Great question. I want to go back just a half a second too, because you brought up innovation, and that innovation piece is essential for us to move forward. And the ability to innovate. So there's a book that I actually like, and I think I've mentioned it to you before, by Edmund Phelps, called Mass Flourishing, right? And part of what Phelps says is that the economies that were most productive throughout history also happen to be the ones that engage people the most broadly. and enabled them and gave them provided the conditions for them to innovate. This is really interesting because this is about SMEs, right? So it's about everybody. It's about inclusion, and I find that a really important thing to sort of think about, because if our economies are about this rather than redistributing the wealth that's created, we start going a different direction, right? If we're about empowering innovation across our economies, across our societies, across borders, then we've got a different game underway, and we start thinking about expenditures, and we start thinking about what does productivity mean, also in terms of inclusion. So how do you? For me, that narrative piece. So it's not just about telling a story. Obviously, the narrative for me is something that's incredibly practical. So we know also this thing that I was just mentioning around innovation. So we know, for example, that countries that are successful and have been successful in value chains, it's not that they have just one company, it's that they have these networks of interconnected capacities, they have effective regulatory systems, they have effective social systems, they have effective educational systems, and to the extent that those systems are more or less effective, they become more competitive. So that's like the real side for me of that narrative. Like that narrative, we can think up a story, we can imagine a beautiful story, and we should imagine those beautiful stories, but we have in our hands the material to make a real story about how the economies are changing and what are the next steps that we can take. We start understanding what those next steps are if we look at some of the innovation that's happening. It's bubbling up all over the place, including amongst these young people. I've learned a tremendous amount from people who are a lot younger than I am, because they're innovating, they're going out and they're undertaking these things holistically from the beginning. This is fascinating. We need more of that kind of support. So when I talk about a narrative, I think we all have narratives. We all want something better for our future, but I don't think that has to be a pie in the sky narrative. I think that narrative can be one that's incredibly grounded and based in what we know and what we think will happen.
As I heard you speaking about supply chains and clusters, it made me think immediately about ecosystems, natural ecosystems, and how efficient nature is at taking resources, building or growing, and then whatever is a residue of a natural process, it automatically and 100% becomes an input for some other natural process. So when we talk about circular economy, the real circular economy is nature. So how do we, or shouldn't we, spend more time observing and imitating nature? And well, that's what's called biomimicry. And if the answer is yes, then shouldn't we make more efforts to bring more robustness to the ecosystems that we have and figure out a way to regenerate some of the ones that have been lost? There is a statistic that always troubles me, and it is the fact that in the last 200 years, when our economy has expanded tens of thousands of times, and when human population in those 200 years has grown eightfold, the biosphere has lost 80% of its biocapacity. So in terms of a new renaissance, what I see today is an enormous opportunity for nature to recover, and that will give us a lot more material, information, inputs to imitate nature in that circularity and that efficiency, so that we design our industrial, political, market-based ecosystems around the efficiencies of nature. How would you think about this?
I think that's a good way of imagining. Biomimicry is something we need to pay attention to. So I think that, we're not going to. I don't think. Look, we're in this crisis now, this COVID crisis, and as remarkable as the response has been, and we've reduced, the air traffic and all of that, um, I am not sure, seeing this, whether having, having the evidence in your face is going to really make people change. One of the things I think will help people change is when they see the potential and they see the evidence of what their innovation can do. And if it can generate positive positive returns, if it can generate inclusion, then that's a good thing. I think people will respond to that. And if it's guided, and if it has wisdom in a way, if there's some, again, enabling framework that lets us understand to what extent does that replicate biological systems or replicate that objective of biological systems, then I think that's has the potential to be very powerful. Look at all the money that's flowing to ESG funds in the last 10 years. A lot of money. People are seeing that the risk, essentially the risk on the other side, has grown, and that's part of the reason, along with the wish to do something that's more aligned with where investors want to be. So the more that we strengthen the markets for those kinds of innovations, I think the more likely we are to find money flowing into those kinds of projects.
Very good. And I wouldn't want to leave this conversation without at least mentioning a topic that has resulted in part from our conversation today, also from your article. I think it is inspired, but more and more these days, I see more people talking and writing about universal basic income. Are we now ready to have that discussion globally? How do we create a support system for the most vulnerable, so that we worry about them actively, and we give them a baseline from where they can comfortably think in terms of innovating, and think in terms of preserving nature, and think in terms of contributing to what society and civilization and the planet needs. What would be your take on universal basic income?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that's got to be part of the picture. I still think that but you have to start somewhere. So it's income for what? People worry that, okay, others may abuse it. But actually, I think it's in the direction that we've been talking about. If you give people the space to innovate, they will innovate instead of just trying to survive. And I think that's an important step. So the universal basic income or some version of it, I think is really important. But you need the other changes as well. It needs to go along with opportunities for training, opportunities for inclusion that are remunerated at a level we expect, to be able to survive, along with a basic income, whatever it is. So I think that's hugely important. The social relationships, our social relationships, are driving the environmental picture. So we have to be able to refashion them. We have to not only fashion them in a way that they're not doing harm, but actually let's fashion them in a way that they do well. Let's do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's so important, because we have realized now, in times of so-called social distancing, which actually I would argue it is not social distancing what we need, it's physical distancing. But socially, we need each other more than ever. So yeah, social solidarity. How do we put empathy to good use now that it is so needed? Empathy is a word out there, almost academic, and we need empathy, because out of empathy, we will see solidarity emerge. And when solidarity emerges, then we can guide it and focus it towards justice and peace, which I think is at the other end, at the better end of this pandemic and sanitary and economic crisis, that is adding complexity to two other accelerations that we already had, which was climate change and the fourth industrial revolution, which we all knew was going to displace some traditional jobs from the past paradigm, so to speak, industrial paradigm. And it's going to create a lot more as well. We know that. But what do we do with the ones that are going to be destroyed? Unfortunately, we've run out of time, which makes me feel that we will have to come back and regroup again in a near future. And I would like to ask you, what would be your key takeaway from these 25 minutes?
Great. I love where you ended, because there's like a moral, whatever you want to call it, side, and there is a technical side. They're not so far apart. I don't think they're so far apart, but we've kept them apart. And I think that, we've kept them apart through the way we've structured our society. I'm not suggesting we merge religion and society, no, but there's definitely a moral and an individual understanding and reinterpretation, re-understanding who am I, not just who are we, and we have those tools at hand. So I'm glad you brought us back there to that point, because that's I think where I am as well.
Great, excellent. Andrew, thank you very much. Stay safe, enjoy the spring as much as you can, and I hope to get in touch with you soon.
Thank you. Great to talk with you. It's been a pleasure. Let's do it again.
All right, bye-bye.
Ciao.